Wonderful. Good evening. So nice to see so many of you. Now, I'm sure our head is busy with so many things now. Yom Kippur is just around the corner. What are we going to do on Yom Kippur? Is the shul going to be open? Who knows? Maybe a message didn't go out yet, and if it is, do I want to go? And if I want to go, how do I go? For how long? I mean, all these things are probably on our head. How our Yom Kippur is going to look like a very unusual Yom Kippur, but that is not what I want to talk about this evening. I don't want to talk about all that. That's what is on our head right now, and it's very important, but I want to talk about something which is even more important. It has to do with the Segel, which we're entering right now. We're entering the second Segel, and this time I want us to do it right. Now, what do I mean by that? Did we do something wrong last time? So I think we got something wrong last time. I want to open with an experience I had less than 2 years ago in Majdanek, Poland. I was there with my previous congregation, and we were standing under the great monument, terrible monument, a pile 6 tons of ashes and bone parts of the victims that were taken out of the crematorium. And on top of the pile, there is this big stone hedge. Obviously, I couldn't stand under the stone because I'm a Kohen, and there are literally bone parts in this pile. So I was standing a few meters away. And as I was standing there, I remembered my grandfather, Zaidi, as we called him, and something he said at the very last brit of one of his grandsons in which he participated. But before I share with you what he said, I want to pose a question. What is the secret of our survival? Because that also went through my head. As I was standing there in Majdanek, looking at that pile of ashes, I was asking myself, how is it that here in Poland, I'm standing in front of a pile, 6 tons of, it's a huge, huge pile of ashes. And I know that I'm coming from a flourishing state of a vibrant nation. What's the secret? How did we manage to survive it all? How did we manage to survive 3,000 years with so much suffering, misery, persecution? Now, any nation, its survival depends first and foremost on the collective awareness of its people. As long as people feel they're part of a nation, they identify as part of a nation, then that nation exists. The moment it stops, then that nation does not exist anymore. But with us, with the Jewish people, it's even more than that, because we don't have just an ordinary collective experience. Our collective experience is the Torah. As Rav Stadia Gaon says, Ein Yisrael Uma Ela B'Torotea. It is the Torah that makes us one. as we identify with this, it informs us of who we are, of our history. It tells us what's right, what's wrong. It tells us what to strive towards. It connects us with our God, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with one another. The Torah is what brings us together, what makes us a nation, says Rav Saadia Gaon. So obviously the secret of survival is not forgetting the Torah. What is the secret of not forgetting the Torah? Well, there is a story in the Gemara about Rabbi Chanan and Rabbi Chia, who were a chavuta, and they were studying. And from time to time, the argument between them used to get heated. And then Rabbi Chanan would turn to Rabbi Chia and say, "What are you even arguing with me? I'm much more clever than you are. I'm so clever that if the Torah would, God forbid, be forgotten from the people of Israel, with my intellect, I would be able to reconstruct it." And Rabbi Chia tells him, "You know something? You're right, Rabbi Chanan. If it were forgotten, if it were to be forgotten, you would have been able to reconstruct it. But do you know why it wasn't forgotten? That's because of me." Why? What did I do? Well, when I was younger, I was very worried. I was worried that the Torah is going to be, that the young generation is not connected to the Torah. And I thought, what must I do? So I went and I saw my field with cotton seeds. Then I reaped it. Then I wove them into threads. Then I sewed them into nets. Then I took those nets and I hunted deers. I slaughtered the deers. I took the meat and gave it to poor people, to orphans and widows. And then I took the skin, and on the skin I wrote Sifrei Torah. The moment I had enough Sifrei Torah, I started going around from village to village, from town to town, and each place I got to, I took 11 children and taught them, each child one book, the 5 books of the Torah and the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Each child one book. Once they were fluent, I told them, "My dear children, teach each other whatever you know. That way, eventually they will know everything." And then I moved on to the next village and to the next town and so on and so forth. And that is why Torah was not forgotten from the people of Israel. What a story. First of all, obviously, Rav Chia is telling Rav Chanan, you think that the intellect is what is going to save the Torah? You think that sophisticated shiurim, that is what is going to save the Torah? No. It is the simple Torah that is taught to little children. That little thing, that is what is going to save, to make sure that the Torah is not going to be forgotten. But Rav Chia does a lot more. He works years and years before he even teaches, because he starts from scratch. He sows the field, then he harvests it, then he does the nets, then he goes and hunts the deers. Why? Why go through that long process? I think, first of all, Rav Chia teaches us that education is hard work. And it's not something you do just like that. And it takes a lot of preparation. And you have to start from the very, very bottom and work your way up. That is the secret with education. And he takes the meat of the deer and feeds it to the poor, because education, caring for people's souls, comes together with caring for their physical welfare as well. Without that, it doesn't work. And that whole thing together, eventually, that makes sure that Torah will not be forgotten from the people of Israel. So if I ask myself, what is our secret of survival? Obviously, education. First and foremost, teaching Torah to the young generation, making sure they hold on to the gachelet and pass it on to the next generation. And education was always a high priority in Jewish tradition. The Gemara says that a city that doesn't have a melamed tinokot, that doesn't have an institution that teaches the little children, machrivim ota, should be destroyed. Some say it should be machrimim ota, should be banned. The Rambam says both. It should be banned, and if that doesn't help, it should be destroyed. What a statement. It doesn't say it about a shul. It doesn't say it about a mikveh. It doesn't say it about any other Jewish institution. Only about one institution. A melamed tinokot, a place, a person that will teach the little children. That is the most important. That is the number one thing in Jewish life. And that was our secret throughout the generations. Chazal tell us, Zachur oto ha'ish latov v'Rabbi Yoshua ben Gamla shmo, she'emid melamed tinokot b'chol pelech v'pelech. Over 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago almost, Rabbi Yoshua ben Gamla, we know very little about him. But because that's from a time that there's very little records from. But he already had established that every place there will be a melamed tinokot, a school to teach Torah to the Jewish children. That has always been our number one priority. Now, coming back to last Segel, we went into last Segel. It was difficult. It was difficult, if you remember. We were shut at home for a very long time, but slowly we found ways of dealing with the situation. And we also found ways of dealing with our spiritual lives. So we couldn't go to shul, but then we found the minyanei mirpasot, and then the minyanei chatzerot, then the minyanei rechovot. Slowly we found ways of dealing with the situation. Now, there were sectors that we forgot, but we remembered that we are forgetting them. There were lonely people at home, older people, or some that were not necessarily older people, but who don't have a family, who were there on their own and went through a very tough time. Some of them needed help, didn't always get it when they wanted. We forgot about them, but we remembered from time to time that we are forgetting them. But then there was one sector that we forgot, and we didn't even remember we are forgetting them. The younger generation. Children and youth that went through months and months of sitting on the couch, on their devices, having nothing to wake up for in the morning, no spiritual life whatsoever. And I think we let them down. And first and foremost, I'm speaking as a rabbi. I let them down. And if I ask myself, when I do a cheshbon nefesh of what we have to get right this year, then last time we went into the segel, this time we want to go into the segel and get it right, not forget the young. Now, the corona is a problem, but it's not a big a problem. It's not as big as the chronic issues that it brings up to the surface. Every day, there are lots of problems that we live with. We don't pay attention to because in our day-to-day life, they're just, we sweep them under the carpet. But then comes a time of stress, and those issues come up. And the corona is a type of stress. In a way, the blowing the corona, yes, blowing the keren, the shofar. The Rambam says that the shofar is gzeirat hakatuv. We blow it because Hashem told us to, but there is remez yeshbo. There's a hint there that it is waking us up. So the keren, the horn, the corona that wakes us up is waking us up now to issues that have always been there. The problem of chinuch in the modern religious world is not a new issue. It's been with us for decades. And we think about it. From time to time, we talk about it, but the problem is there. And the corona is now reminding us of that problem. And this brings me to what my grandfather said on that brit, and those thoughts that I was having when standing in my danik on that cold morning. My grandfather never spoke of his family that perished in the Holocaust. And I was standing there thinking, who knows, in this pile, maybe his son, maybe his daughter, his wife, parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, perhaps. Who knows? He never spoke about them himself, never spoke about his post-Holocaust experience, never but once in that brit. So that brit of his last grandson that was born when he was still alive, before the brit, he came to my uncle and he asked him, do you mind calling the child, your son, Moshe? Moshe is a nice name. Please call him Moshe. He didn't say why. We suspect that Moshe was the name of his son that was murdered in the Holocaust. And at the brit, my grandfather spoke. And he said, you know, ever since the Holocaust, wherever I went, I was haunted. I was haunted by those who I knew back in Poland who weren't with us anymore, who perished. Their ghosts were following me everywhere. My life was almost unbearable. And although I managed to have a new family and lead a life, my grandfather was a rabbi in a community in New York for many years and then retired and made Aliyah here to Israel. But I'm telling you, my life was unbearable. I never spoke about it. And he says, now here in Israel, I still see all of those that I knew back in Poland. But now they don't haunt me anymore. Now they're not ghosts, but they're real souls in new bodies, in flesh and blood. All of these children that we see running around here in the neighborhood where I live in Yerushalayim, here while I'm talking in the Brit, my own children, my own grandchildren, these are the neshamot, these are the souls that I knew back in Poland. Now, my grandfather here was echoing the vision of Yechezkel, the vision of the dry bones, a modern vision of the dry bones. In the Gemara, there is a machloket. There's a dispute about the dry bones that Yechezkel had. The famous vision where Yechezkel goes after the great destruction. The temple is ruined. The people are dispersed, exiled. And the Jewish people think that is their end because it should have been their end. Everything was gone. And as Yechezkel say, Beit Yisrael omrim nigzarnu avadnu, we're doomed, we're lost. Yavshu atzmotenu, our bones are dried. And here Hashem takes Yechezkel and brings him to a valley filled with dry bones. And he tells Yechezkel, Hinaveh al atzamot haile. And Yechezkel starts prophesying and he says, I see how slowly the bones begin to grow flesh and skin over the flesh, but they're still dead. And then God tells me, prophesize, Hinaveh al atzamot, and I begin to prophesy, Vatavo b'hem haruach, and the spirit comes within them, and they rise, and they live. And God tells Yechezkel, so too the people of Israel will live. Now there's a dispute in the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer says that these bones, the life came in them, They rose up, they sang a song to God, and died again. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua says no. They got up, they sang a song to God, went to Eretz Yisrael, had children, and their children's children still live today. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, I am a descendant of one of those people, of one of those dry bones. And when I think about us, and I was standing there in Majdanek, I was thinking, in many ways, we are those dry bones. Second and third generation to the Holocaust, we grew in the shadow of our parents that might have been survivors, our grandparents that might have been survivors, in communities of survivors. We grew in that great shadow. And in many ways, we rose out of the ashes. Our generation rose out of the ashes of Auschwitz and Majdanek and Treblinka. And now the question is, are we going to rise, live, say Shirah, and die? Because the younger generation is not going to hold on to what it is supposed to hold on to? Is Rabbi Eliezer going to be right in our case? Or are we going to live on? Because our younger generation are going to carry on the task. We won't just say a song to God and die, but we'll say a song to God, and we, Baruch Hashem, came to the land of Israel, but we'll live on, and our spirit will continue to live on within our children, within our grandchildren. We'll continue to be that great Jewish people that lives and devoted to Hashem with the Torah. That great secret, would that continue? And that depends on what we're going to do with our children, on whether we're going to forget them or whether we're going to understand the secret of Abchia and live up to what, educate them. So now we're going into the second segel. And we're going in, and I want to do it right. I want us to remember our children. And us, I mean each and every one of us. Myself as a rabbi, all of us as parents, as grandparents, as friends, to remember the young generation, to not forget them behind. Our number one priority in this segel has to be making sure, forget about everything else. Everything else is less important. What we're going to do with Yom Kippur, how are we going to survive Sukkot, all those are not important questions. The one important question is how our children are going to spiritually survive this segel. After months and months of the most informative year, during the most informative years of their lives that have been wasted, how are we making sure that these months are not going to be wasted? And yes, maybe schools will have some sort of things on Zoom or yes Zoom, not Zoom, Limud Merachok, all of these things. The schools don't help much even when they're open. When they're closed, they're not going to help too much. It's in our hands as parents, as a community. We have to make sure that our children have what to wake up to in the morning and that they have a spiritual life during these times. As a community, I'm going to make it my number one task as rabbi to build a program for our children. But why am I telling you this? Because it takes a village to raise a child. It takes myself, together with Rav Nehemiah and Rabbanit Racheli, but also each and every one parents, grandchildren, grandparents that will make sure that everyone, we are all in this together. And the most important thing is the future of our children. Let's make sure that they get through this segel safely, and spiritually safely. I wish us all a Gmar Chatima Tova, and I ask each and every one of you, if you have ideas, if you want to help in any way, please let me know, and we'll get through this together for ourselves, for the sake of our children. Gmar Chatima Tova.